Welcome back in to Patient No Longer, the podcast that continues to explore human understanding. And this topic in particular is going to be fascinating to put up against human understanding. I've got Todd Quartiere from Vynamic. He is the leader of responsible AI. I love this. Thank you, Todd, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Well, your background is really interesting, and responsible AI is something I got to dig into. But Todd, he's been a visionary leader pushing the limits of performance improvement. 12 years experience between providing care as an EMT in health service operations. You've been in management consulting, nonprofit leadership. Your role at Vynamic as leader of responsible AI. You're also the executive director of the Foundation for AI in Health and a host of the AI Vitals podcast. So I have a fellow podcast host with me today. I'd love to go toe-to-toe with that. And also, you really try to help clients of all ilk to simplify their AI journey as an action-oriented partner driving growth, performance, and culture. You're trying to cut through the noise to enable successful adoption of AI. Nobody's talking about AI right now, right, Todd?
No one at all.
So your tilt on this, though, is different. And you talk a lot about this and this idea of responsible AI. For our listeners and viewers, what is responsible AI?
Yeah. And really, when I use the word responsible, I can separate it out from AI. Maybe separately, we'll dive into what AI is. But
Sure.
The responsibility piece, to me, is a balancing act of all of the different principles that we often talk about: ethics, safety, accountability, and the practical reality of commercializing these products. And the commercialization means that we are advancing opportunities for revenue, cost savings, disruption in industries, and that balancing act is what defines responsible AI to me.
Balancing between the worlds. So you already set it up. Let me ask you then, what is just AI in your mind?
We hear a lot about AI this, AI that,
Yes.
But I try to cut through the noise a lot. And when I'm talking about AI, break it into one of three things. And it can do one or more of these three. But if it doesn't do one of these three, it's either not an AI, or maybe it has an AI as a component, but it is not all
It's
the
not
AI.
100%. Okay.
Exactly. If it can learn on its own,
Okay.
however, whatever form that takes, that is an AI. If it can interpret sensory information, if it can hear, see, if you talk to Google, they're working on one that smells, that's an AI. Or if it can make unclear decisions, so not an algorithm that has a statistical model that says this is the right decision, but if it can look at 50 different algorithms and make a decision which one would be the best, try to figure out through 100 or 1,000 different variables what it needs to determine and then go down that path, that's AI. It's making some unclear decisions, kind of like how you or I would think through a problem.
I was just thinking about your three lists. I was like, can I do these things? So learn, interpret information, and make unclear decisions. I mean, you've also described humans.
I have. And last week, someone yelled out at me, oh, that's me. And
I'm not alone.
what I like to say is, well, we're not artificial, right? We use artificial to say that we are creating a category of technologies that replicate a combination of human-like traits.
Mm.
And that's why it's everywhere. Is AI is becoming more and more human-like. Even if you look under the works, whether it is or is not making decisions and having thoughts, and I put thoughts in quotation marks, the same way as you or I, it looks more and more like it is.
It's so interesting too, because so the human element, the way that you bring it up, and I completely agree. There's the authenticity of humans and the artificiality of AI, but it's getting closer. I'm curious, when we think about humans, and NRC Health's mission is human understanding. Whether you're a consumer, patient out there living your life, you're a human being who will need healthcare. So in your mind, Todd, and what you've studied extensively on AI, what is AI's biggest impact on the patient and what they see, right? Because they don't see everything. But what's the biggest impact of AI on the patient and really the patient experience as we know it?
I think a lot of what we familiarized ourselves with in human-to-human interactions is going to become better and lower cost through a combination of different types of AI. And I say a combination because I like to move away from just the term and
Sure.
start talking about some specificities. When patients are interacting with a patient service rep and they're trying to schedule an appointment or ask when their next appointment is, or just ask a question, how do I navigate a hospital? And that's a great one I'll come back to.
Sure.
We often think of it as this human-to-human interaction. A person calls into a call center, they have this lengthy validation process, and then they might get their answer, or they might need to get transferred to a clinic and get their question answered. And it takes a lot of time. The patient service rep might not be having a good day. Maybe they're not having a great interaction. There's a lot of disruption happening today or tomorrow that looks a lot different. And it takes a patient through a much more user-friendly journey. If we think of our experiences at banks or at a lot of other organizations that like to care for their customers and the customer experience, we start to move away from this disruptive, broken, everyone has a piece of the puzzle process and move into what does it look like if a generative tool, conversational AI using language models and sensitive considerations for how the patient might be feeling and what they might be asking. And we have them guided through a series of frequently asked questions or pulled answers. And so you start to take things that you associated with human-to-human interactions and place them now into a technology category and say, oh, maybe I don't need to call into this call center, go through this process. Maybe I can open an app, go to a website, even call a number, right? We have voice AI.
Sure.
And have something guide me through the process that is always going to be as sensitive and caring as it's designed to be. That is always going to have my interests in mind and have my information right at its fingertips with near perfect accuracy.
You do a good job of just naturally talking about the human element of AI and how it will affect patients, how they can, call someone up any time of day and get a consistent answer, even if it's not another human being. But there's another line of thought. I hear this from nurses particularly. I hear this from a lot of people. I think you know where I'm going but it can't replace humans. It shouldn't replace humans. And I think there's a lot of validity to that concern, we'll say. So if that nurse was standing across from you, unlike me, and saying, but are you replacing humanity? What would be your answer to that?
I think it's going to be similar to other technology disruptions we've seen in the past. If we think about accounting and how calculators came in and did away with a lot of paper number crunching jobs, the jobs didn't disappear, they transformed.
Right.
If we think about that same scenario with patient service reps and where we've gotten today, those patient service reps are answering calls, answering the same questions, waiting for insurance verification to load and sitting there saying, I'm sorry, my computer's being slow today. But that's not patient experience. That's not human experience.
Right.
That's bureaucratic need. That's administrative overhead. Where we could get back to and where I see us going is starting to consider that person might not want someone person to person online. What about when they go to the clinic and they're waiting? Are there ways that we can take patient service reps who've been on the phone and start to improve experiences in person? What about navigating through hospitals? I don't think I've gone to a hospital and not found a patient lost somewhere along where I was
everywhere.
Going. Exactly.
I've been there for meetings and you see them get lost. And even though I work in healthcare, I think a lot of our listeners can agree, when I'm trying to navigate my own care as a patient, it doesn't matter that I'm in healthcare. I get as lost as anyone else. Your point about the administrative tasks, sometimes what we consider a human experience, let's take AI out of it for a second. What we consider a totally human experience can be quite inhumane. I'm filling out forms, I'm waiting around. There's no one in front of me interacting with me. So I love your point about AI coming in and helping some of those pieces, but the humanity, the true humanity remains.
That's exactly right. And we're going back to it. We've moved away from it as paperwork's increased and the needs of our overhead have increased. But I think as different forms of AI are able to tackle the straightforward tasks, the straightforward questions, the administrative processes. I mean, if we're thinking about scheduling, and I mentioned I'd come back to navigating a hospital.
Right.
There are always going to be patients, people who are sick, ill, and maybe not well, who will need to be navigated through the hospital. No matter what technology we employ, they need someone to be with them, and that someone being with them is going to improve their care. But what about those that don't, who are just trying to quickly navigate a hospital? There are virtual and augmented reality capabilities now that we could show someone where they're going in a hospital ahead of time. Rather than have them walk up to the front desk, say, how am I going to get to the clinic? And they say, 3 lefts, 2 rights, go straight down the hall and up the stairs. What if they could show them a video and say, hey, you're going to follow this path. And if you get lost along the way, you'll see a tablet halfway that you can click, select where you're going, and it'll show you the rest of the way.
You'd feel like so much more supported. And I think with healthcare, people would look at that ahead of time. I mean, they know how important that experience is. They don't have them as frequently. I really love what you said about we're getting back to it. It's almost like a restoration in some ways of humanity versus losing something. I want to ask you about, in your experience, your line of work, and with Vynamic as well, you run into different leaders of different ilk, and they're very different on AI. And I want to ask you, what is the common identifier of the leader that you see that is really into AI, learning about it and wanting to approach it? And I'll only throw out one caveat. It's not about age, because I've had CEOs who are 70 years old who are extremely excited about AI. I've had leaders in their 30s and 40s who are not. So what are the common traits of someone that really gets it in your mind?
I think you're absolutely right that it's not about age. What I've seen is it's a lot about, do they understand not AI as this big bucket of technologies, but as capability enablers and as a part of the architecture. And that understanding means that they're not chasing shiny objects, and they're not worried when the shiny object breaks. AI has never been the be-all and end-all. It's not going to fix healthcare. It's not going to heal the world. But what it will do is improve a lot of specific things. And we're already seeing it improve provider documentation. We're already seeing it improve customer conversations. And where there are opportunities for improvements, not so much moonshot, let's see what it can do.
Right.
But where there are improvements, we start to see leaders who have this mentality of, all right, I'm going to take a balanced approach, understand that this is a part of the ecosystem, and try and build a roadmap that it's going to take me to be able to experiment with some moonshots possibly, but also start to adopt where we're seeing really strong applications.
And those applications are solutions. I was talking to someone in innovation in this season of Patient No Longer who mentioned, we're looking for creative solutions to problems that already exist. I think sometimes people view AI as this new thing, when in fact, the way you talk about it, it meshes perfectly with processes now and what can be improved. And if there's any industry that has processes that can be improved, healthcare has it in spades.
That's exactly right.
I want to come back to some of the things you said earlier, but I got to throw in the speed round. This is our fun break. Let's take a little break from healthcare. Yeah. I'm going to ask you some fast questions here. Our listeners tend to know these, but you don't. So these are off the cuff. Just give your top of mind answer.
Okay. Can do.
Putting on my research hat. Okay. So for the speed round, a couple of these. Coke or Pepsi?
Neither. I don't drink soda.
Okay. C, none. Fiction or nonfiction?
Fiction.
Nice. Morning person or night owl?
Night owl.
Okay. Favorite movie or favorite TV show of all time? This always stumps people the most.
I feel like as I have consumed more media over the years, it's becoming harder and harder to pin down. In the past, I used to say Shawshank Redemption was my favorite movie, but I'll be honest, I haven't seen Shawshank Redemption in a long time now.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm having a harder time with this one, but maybe Shawshank's the easy answer and say it's probably something else over the past few years.
Let's put Shawshank in as your placeholder for now.
Perfect.
And we still have a few minutes. So I remember watching Shawshank Redemption. It would air back to back to back on TBS when I was a kid. And it's right up there for me. So I'm with you on that. And that was also probably the most thoughtful answer we've had in a speed round, by the way. Points to Todd for that. Last one, East Coast or West Coast?
East Coast.
Okay. Very good. Let's get back into something that you talked about earlier, and that was digital transformation. And I think in a lot of ways, AI has become the go-to. If I'm talking about even thinking about forming a singular thought on digital transformation, AI is like that vacuum that sucks it up. But one of the issues I see with executives is they've heard a lot about digital transformation over the last 15 years, even longer. A lot about how everything's going to change this year. And in some ways it didn't. So what would you say to someone who's thinking of digital transformation, hearing about it, hearing about AI specifically, and thinking, I just don't really know if things are going to change that much? What would be your answer to that?
I think part of it is first recognizing where they are. There's not going to be convincing someone who's burnt out from digital transformation that this next piece of the digital transformation is going to be any better.
Yeah.
There's a pause point to recognize where people are. And we're coming out of COVID. People's energy might be low. And if it's low, we're not looking at them as early adopters. There are people who are going to be convincing will be early adopters. But what will happen is over time, like we were talking about earlier, clear use cases are going to come up. It's not going to be the shiny object. It'll just be a part of the technology stack. And there's going to be this expectation, not this desire that you're incorporating technologies that are best for your work. And when I say best for your work, I'm talking about if someone asked you to build a PowerPoint presentation, but they said you can't use PowerPoint and you got to use pen and paper or Microsoft Paint. It's just not the right tools. We are going to see more and more AI as a part of the technology stack that we know or we're familiar with. And as it becomes more commonplace, there's going to be that expectation that even people who are low energy, slow adopters, or maybe just burnt out, will see not just the opportunity, but the need to adopt.
I love your point about the shiny objects and how the adoption can really happen slow and over time and almost be subtle. And that's what people should be watching for. There was a time a couple years ago where we certainly weren't talking about responsible AI, which is so creative and interesting, but AI was kind of in a lineup with, Web3, NFTs. There was all these things kind of coming around right around the time of COVID, and it's foggy now to try to pick them out of the lineup. But what is something that you consider to be a possible source of digital transformation that isn't AI and either isn't getting talked about enough or isn't getting talked about at all?
Yeah, I think there are some really exciting moonshot answers that I love talking about.
Of course.
Quantum computing always comes to mind and the intersection of quantum computing and AI. But rather than dive into the moonshot, I want to talk about automation. Okay. Because what ends up happening in a lot of the conversations I'm in is we mix conversations about artificial intelligence, which is one of those three things I mentioned earlier,
right,
and automation. And automation has been around for a long time. But what happens today is this mixing of the two that isn't healthy and kind of moves us away from, can AI be a part of the automation journey? The intersection is called intelligent automation. And intelligent automation is where AI is applied to traditional automation. But what we end up seeing in a lot of conversations is AI is replacing automation, or is automation is no longer going to be needed. And that's not true. We actually see some of the best technologies coming out of this disruption, this transformation, are leveraging AI to realize what automation has to happen. Think about patient scheduling. And then carries through the automation in this validated workflow. And the validated workflow isn't AI. Once it starts saying, do you want 9:30 or 10 o'clock, because those are the two appointment availabilities, that's not AI.
Right.
The conversational understanding of what someone says back might be. But the automation is still the same as we've been looking at for many years. And separating out those two conversations really helps us demystify AI.
It demystifies, and it also stops people from working others into a frenzy of AI is replacing these things, which makes people, it almost makes your brain shrink because you start thinking about, I've got to be defensive here and I've got to have a more skeptical outlook, when in fact, The automation part, I completely agree with you. There could be incredible impacts on that, and just thinking of the way that could innovate how we do things in healthcare. I want to also ask you about these disruptors that we give a lot of airtime to, and lately as well, as we're launching into 2025, you've got Walmart that kind of pulled back, CVS that kind of pulled back. You have people saying, see, it's harder than they thought. But then you have folks like Amazon who are sticking around. And with One Medical, they've got some brand equity there that's very interesting to see. Where do you see disruptors coming into? The predictions are tough, but the next couple of years, even in the next 5 years, do you see some of those disruptors, and maybe others we don't even know about yet, that get in and make change in healthcare?
Very much so. I think what we understand as healthcare is largely and quickly going to become health. And a lot of healthcare systems have changed their name. That's the first step in this journey. But really, we're talking about huge corporations with tremendous amounts of money, seeing a market with tremendous amounts of money and saying, oh, we have solutions, technologies, opportunities to step in there. They're not going to stop. They might pivot. The needs might change or the opportunities might change. But you talked about Amazon. And if we talk about AWS owning the largest portion of the cloud market, and having tons of pre-built health-based solutions inside of their environment, they are more and more entering into the health space. I like to pick on Apple. Apple is not a healthcare company, but Apple has now published huge medical studies with their Apple Watch and broken into the space of doing 1 and 2 lead EKGs.
Right on your wrist.
Exactly. That is the extension of a technology company entering into what we traditionally thought of as healthcare. And I think we're only going to see more of that over the next few years.
It's incredible to think about too, because you've got these companies, they're never really going to stop given what's the opportunity in healthcare. They might retrench a little bit. I like your point about pivot, and they're going to come back. I also love your comment about healthcare branding, because there is some that position as health, whether they truly live out the change or not. Probably another podcast for another time. I always want to ask this question of all of our guests before we conclude. You're at Vynamic and you're in an elevator and you've got someone coming in who, sneaks right in behind you.
Yep.
Not a long ride, but they say, you know what, Todd, it's my first day in healthcare. What's a piece of advice you would give me?
Yeah, I think where we are today, it's that try to understand what's tangential to your role. Try to think about not what you're going to learn in orientation today, because you really are not going to remember the HIPAA guidance video that you're going to watch and probably rewatch a few more times in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
But try to understand 1 or 2 degrees past where you are and really know how they connect to what you're doing. So it doesn't matter if you're working in patient access, try to understand a bit more about patient financial services. It doesn't matter if you're working in clinical operations, if you're a nurse, a physician, try to understand 1 or 2 degrees into the financial ecosystem or operations and reporting. If you're working in pharmacy, try to understand clinic management. Branch 1 or 2 degrees outside of where you are, and that's going to make you so much more knowledgeable of not only how to do your role, but also how to care for the people that are coming through our healthcare systems.
It's such great advice, especially for someone who's new, who might be saying, this is my role, this is my responsibility. But from the outset, having that feeling of it's okay to go 1 or 2 degrees over, because these things will shift. And you're a great example of going a few degrees over. Love to talk even more at some point about your podcast and your work at Vynamic and your work with the foundation. But for now, I want to thank you so much for really opening up our eyes on some things about AI that we hadn't seen before, and really appreciate your time on the Patient No Longer podcast.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you, and look forward to any of our future conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Todd, and thank you, everyone.